because certainly there were times my students were struggling with comprehension, and there was just times I'm like, why? Why are you struggling with this? And hindsight's what, 2020, they say. So I can look back and be like, oh, maybe that's the reason why. Hi, and welcome to the Smarter Literacy Podcast from Ascend Smarter Intervention, where our mission is to simplify effective literacy instruction to make teaching literacy easier and more accessible for everyone. We are your hosts, Lindsay
and Corey. And in today's episode, our goals are to open up a conversation about the misconceptions we had around teaching explicit comprehension strategies, to share our experiences teaching comprehension strategies to our students, and to share one thing you can do in your instruction to help incorporate more language comprehension skills into your lessons.
In our last full-length episode, we chatted about our misconceptions about word recognition and decoding skills. Just like we did in that episodes, we are going to break down the truth about comprehension instruction and provide some tips and tricks you can use in your classroom as well. If you've listened to our other episodes, you'll be familiar with what we call the familiarize phase. This episode will once again resonate with anyone in that particular stage.
So if you have no idea what we're talking about when we say the familiarize phase, definitely give that last episode a listen. But we provided a framework to help simplify your literacy intervention, starting with familiarize yourself with the research, then move into systematize your instruction, then you'll move into optimizing your instruction, and then finally you'll move into generalizing and helping your students generalize their skills. So the idea here is to stay focused on the phase that you're in. That being said, regardless of which phase of the journey you're currently in, we'd love to invite you to stick around for this conversation.
All right, Corey, what was one of your biggest misconceptions about teaching comprehension?
There were many, as I said, with the word recognition and decoding skills. But I think when I first started teaching, I was really under the impression that comprehension didn't need explicit teaching. Rather, comprehension was going to be a byproduct of effective word recognition skills. So if you got those decoding skills down, you would have that effective word recognition skills, and then background knowledge on a subject. So as long as you had those two things, you could have the word recognition skills, you could read the words, and you had background knowledge on the subject, you would just naturally have comprehension. So you didn't necessarily need to teach comprehension at all. So kind of this idea that reading comprehension was an outcome and it wasn't necessarily a skill that could be taught.
I've actually heard a lot of educators kind of had that same feeling at least once in their teaching journey as well. My experience was a little different because I did start out as a English teacher, a 7th grade English teacher. So my whole job felt like teaching comprehension, right? That and writing. And so when I did move back to the literacy teaching sphere, basically I kind of got into it and I was kind of like, where is the comprehension? How do I teach comprehension here? Because I've been teaching comprehension for all of my teaching career. And how does it fit into literacy? And as I mentioned in, the previous episode, my first year of kind of being back as a literacy specialist, I was just, again, trying to familiarize myself with how do I be a literacy teacher. So definitely my first year as a literacy specialist, comprehension fell to the wayside. I was just like, I guess I don't do it as a literacy specialist. So that was it was a difficult jump for me.
Well, and I think as an interventionist, I think we felt like, oh, we don't need to teach this because that's going to be taught in the classroom. So I think there was potentially a little bit of a disconnect because what I started to recognize was that many of my students, while we had worked through the word recognition, we made sure that they were talking about topics that they enjoyed, like sports or science or things that they were really interested in. I started noticing that my students did not necessarily have the comprehension, and that could have been from a number of different reasons.
Right.
Could have been because when the teacher was going through the comprehension skills, they were still struggling so much with the decoding that they weren't taking those comprehension skills in at that time. Or they just, again, weren't making the connection. So same thing that we talked about last time where they weren't generalizing into different contexts. They just didn't notice that, oh yeah, I should be using those strategies in this other space.
Right. Yeah. I actually, I do remember someone telling me the first time when I was, again, my first year as that literacy specialist, and I kind of asked like, oh, when do I, again, about comprehension, how much should I, and someone did say to me, oh, well, they're getting in the classroom. And then I can't remember if it was that year or the year afterwards, but I had a conversation with an English teacher and she said, "Oh, but they're learning this in your classroom, right?" And I said, "Oh no, there is definitely a disconnect here." And like you said, I think there's a disconnect just for the students overall.
Yeah. And so I think what that comes down to is the truth is that we can and should be teaching comprehension explicitly, whether we are in the classroom, whether we are in an intervention setting. We do need to be incorporating that into our instruction. And it's not necessarily just a byproduct, it is a skill that we can teach and that we should be focusing on. And so, one of the things that we like to think about is a 3-part reading comprehension framework where we focus on before reading, during reading, and after reading strategies so that we can make sure that we are explicitly teaching students what they need to be doing in each of those different phases. So, for example, before reading, we could be focusing on what are the text features? What are the things that we have available to us? Do we know who the author is? What are some clues that we might have? And what is our background knowledge so that we can start to pull that background knowledge that we have. And then we can start to move into that during reading phase where we can start to look at annotations. So one of the things that we like to annotate are the 5 W's. So who, what, when, where, why. But there might be other annotations that you could pull in too. But just what are you noticing as you're reading? This is also a really good place where we're focusing on self-monitoring, whether that's vocabulary knowledge or decoding. That word recognition still coming in really important here. And then finally, we can move into our after reading strategies, which start to look at what can we recall? So direct recall, how can we organize the information? So thinking about sequencing and main idea. How can we make connections? So that might be text connections, compare and contrast, cause and effect. Then how do we make leaps with that information? So what kind of inferences or predictions can we make? And then finally, we want to get into that analysis phase where we start to really think about what do I take away and really synthesizing the information and what are my next steps and how does this align with everything I already know? But by following that 3-step process of before reading, during reading, and after reading, we can really actually give students explicit comprehension strategies.
I love that. I love teaching kids that. It's so much fun. So as we continue this conversation about teaching comprehension, you can kind of think of it in this way. We're not going to be giving you the fish, but we're going to be teaching you how to fish. However, you are still going to need the fishing rod, and that could be your graphic organizers, your comp companions, all of that. So as we continue the conversation, just kind of keep that in mind. So Corey, did you have any other misconceptions about comprehension instruction?
Yeah, for sure. Originally, I came from a mindset that teaching comprehension strategies was ineffective. So I had been exposed to some research. So Daniel Willingham from the University of Virginia, he's a researcher, cognitive psychologist, is fantastic. He has a lot of really great information. And he did some studies and work around time allocation. So really, how much time are we spending on different strategies and different techniques as we're teaching reading? And one of the things that he found was that far too much time was being spent on teaching comprehension strategies, and that time would be better spent on teaching other skills. And so for me, I took that to mean that teaching comprehension strategies was ineffective. So you just shouldn't do that because you're wasting time. You should really be focusing on those word recognition skills and those other foundational skills. But what I started to realize was that we do need to teach these skills. So it's not that teaching comprehension strategies is ineffective. It's that if we only teach these strategies in isolation and we don't help students make that connection to their real life reading, that's where it starts to become ineffective. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're still giving that explicit introduction. So that might mean we are doing a strategy in isolation, but then we need to give them a framework so that they can start to see how does that fit into my everyday reading.
Absolutely. And we, talked about that a little bit in our last episode when it was all the word decoding.
Yep.
So again, just kind of emphasizing that all of this, we're teaching kids how to use this in their other classes, but also the reading that they're doing on their own. And it's just so important and it's worthwhile to do.
Absolutely. And I think a big piece of that too is, again, just giving them more of the framework that they can use those strategies in. So, for example, if you just teach compare and contrast, or you just teach main idea, or you just teach all of those in isolation and they don't see how that comes together,
Mhm.
that can be an issue. And so I think that comes back to what we were saying about the before reading, during reading, and after reading strategies,
Yes.
is that if you can show them where those fit in, it's so much more effective for them.
And I have to say, even reflecting back to when I was a seventh grade English teacher, so much of the time that I spent on comprehension was that analysis part. Now I can look back and, in hindsight, I'm like, oh, yeah, maybe I didn't do enough of those other strategies to really make everything kind of come together for my students. Because certainly there were times my students were struggling with comprehension, and there was just times I'm like, why? Why are you struggling with this? And hindsight's what, 2020, they say. So I can look back and be like, oh, maybe that's the reason why.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also there's this idea that, when I originally got into the field, I thought comprehension's a byproduct. So I also didn't see comprehension as discrete skills that students could learn. So, for example, I didn't think about compare and contrast or cause and effect. I didn't think that students might be good at one area of comprehension
Mhm.
and not as good at another. And so, like you said, some students might be really good at analysis and they're actually really good at doing that, but they're really terrible at direct recall. And so I think that was helpful for me to recognize too, is that we can start to break that down and figure out which areas of comprehension are students excelling in and which areas maybe are they not,
Yeah,
so that we can focus our instruction on those areas that are a little bit more difficult for them.
absolutely. All right, Corey. So, what about teaching vocabulary specifically? Were there any misconceptions you had about vocabulary comprehension instruction?
Yes, this one's so interesting because I think my first exposure to teaching vocabulary really came from this idea that you give students 10 to 15 vocabulary words, then you do activities around those words, you memorize a dictionary definition, and then you're going to be quizzed on it later. And that probably came from, SAT, GRE. That came from my experience
Yep.
too of in school, this is how you do it. And so I think, even seeing my kids as they went through education, that was really what they were being exposed to as well. And so when I knew vocabulary is a really important piece of the literacy processing triangle of the 5 core components of reading, vocabulary needs to be included. So this is what you do. You give a list of words, you memorize them, you're quizzed on them, and then they're somehow locked into your mind for later.
We like to think it happens,
Right,
right?
right.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you sharing that reminds me of when I was in school and middle school and high school specifically. I just remember all those vocabulary packets that we'd be given. And, here's 10 words to memorize for the test that you'll be taking on Friday. And I just hated it. And so one thing I declared when I when I was going in to be an English teacher was I was not going to give that kind of rote memorization of vocabulary. Like, here's the definition, memorize it, being able to put it on a test, and that's a grade. I was like, I'm not going to do that. And just absolutely not. And I achieved that goal. I didn't do that as an English teacher. However, once again, looking back, I don't think I did much with vocabulary. Not, I think maybe at the time I thought I was doing a good job with vocabulary, but I didn't teach vocabulary explicitly. I didn't really, again, make that part of my comprehension instruction. And when I moved into being a reading specialist at my school, and I did start looking at vocabulary with my kids more specifically, that's when I was like, huh, okay. So maybe what I've been doing the past several years as a ELA teacher wasn't quite right, but and like it was kind of like, again, how do I balance this? Like how do I how do I make vocabulary instruction work?
Absolutely. And I think I ran into the same thing because at first it was like, great, you've got 10, 15 words. This is what you do. But I started to see that that wasn't effective. So I started to see that with my own kids going through school. I remember my own experience of, do I remember any of these words? I don't think I do. And I started to see this isn't working for the students that I'm working with.
Right.
And so what I started to see at that point, though, was I started hearing from some experts in the field, some speech language pathologists that I really respected, that you don't need to worry about teaching specific vocabulary words at all. So at that point, I was really confused. I didn't know, am I supposed to teach words? Am I not supposed to? I know vocabulary is a key piece of the research-based instruction. So what does this need to look like? And I think ultimately what it comes down to is it's not an either or. We do need to teach vocabulary. We do need to make sure that that's being included as part of our instruction. But we don't need to use the rote memorization strategy Instead, what we can do is we can give students a framework to be able to recognize, hey, when are there words that or when are there times that I'm coming into words that I don't recognize as I'm reading? What does that look like? And what can I do when I notice that that is in fact the case? So for example, if I do notice, oh, I don't know what this word is, okay, that means I need to really look at what category or group would this fit into, right? What is the function or purpose of this word? What is it sort of like? What is it not like? And maybe I need to look that up to be able to get to that, or I need to ask somebody. But that's going to be much more effective. The other thing that's going to be effective is to make sure that we're also focusing on words that are going to be important for students' actual learning.
Absolutely.
So if we're in science and we're introducing a new topic, we might want to pull specific words that are going to be important, that are going to be coming up, that it's important for them to know to be able to access the specific text.
Absolutely, yes. So to keep this actionable, how can we effectively incorporate comprehension skills or strategies into our lessons across the grade levels, Corey?
Yeah, so I think the best thing that you can do is really just look at putting together a direct routine that you're going to use with your students time and time again. So we mentioned that we use a before reading, during reading, after reading framework. If that works for you, amazing. You can absolutely utilize that. But essentially what you're looking for is just a checklist or something that students know we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. And if you can teach students how to go through that process, that explicit teaching is going to make a world of difference. It's really going to support their executive functioning as well. And so that's going to be a really helpful strategy in your instruction.
Absolutely. And as we know, structure is really important for our kids. And so this is no exception.
Absolutely.
So try it out and let us know how it goes. If you like extra support, we have a comprehension reading process trifold that can help solidify this process for you. And we'll share it in our show notes so you know where you can grab it. Or if you want extra support, we'd love to have you join us in our Delivering Smarter Intervention program, or 5 core components of literacy library, where we have ongoing monthly coaching calls and can walk you through these strategies specific to your setting and your students. In our next episodes, we will share how these skills translate into writing skills for students. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Smarter Literacy Podcast. Make sure to subscribe for more strategies and insights to make delivering effective literacy instruction easy, or at least easier. And if you found this episode helpful, share it with a friend or leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help others find the show, and we are beyond grateful for your support. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy teaching.